We're going to jump to the other side of Eurasia and quickly look at Western Europe. So, the Black Plague originated in China, and we know it initially cut the Chinese population in half. And the plague traveled all the way to Western Europe by the extensive trade network that was created by the Mongol Empire. And in Europe, the plague was devastating. It took the lives of between a quarter and a third of the European population. So Europe and China have the plague in common. China was also weakened by the Mongol invasions, but it's important to remember the Mongols never made it to Western Europe. So as the Mongols were pushing towards Western Europe, the Great Khan, Ogedei, Genghis Khan's son, died, and it was the custom of the Mongols when the Great Khan died that all the Mongol generals had to return to Mongolia, so Europe was spared. So, just backtracking a bit, after the fall of the Roman Empire, we talked about how Western Europe became extremely decentralized in terms of its governments. People were seeking protection from local rulers that could provide safety nearby. So instead of really big civilizations, we have all these small, self-sufficient manors and castles, and the development of the feudal system. So a term we use for this is political fragmentation. And really this is the complete opposite of China, which had a long history of a really big, unified civilization with a central government. By the 15th century, Europe was still politically fragmented, but the kingdoms were getting much bigger. So, by the 15th century, we have Portugal, Spain, France, England, roughly occupying the territory that they do today. We have the Holy Roman Empire, which is close to what Germany is today. Italy isn't unified, but there's a number of powerful city-states, and these city-states are gaining wealth from trade. So we have states like Venice, Florence, Genoa, Milan, and we also have an emerging Russian Empire based in Moscow. So Western Europe isn't unified politically, it's unified religiously under Christianity, Roman Catholic for the most part, but Eastern Orthodox in the Russian Empire. But all these individual states really created an atmosphere of competition in Europe. There are often wars between the European states. So, for example, England and France fought for over 100 years in the 100 Years' War, which is roughly 1337 to 1453. This type of competition didn't exist in Ming China. So, moving forward, we'll see how China's unity and Europe's disunity initially gives China a big advantage. But as we move through world history, China's unity will come back to bite them, and Europe's competitiveness will eventually put them in a dominant position. So we're comparing Western Europe and China, and I spoke about the maritime expeditions that China had made in the 15th century. But the Chinese were not the only ones making expeditions. Europeans were as well. The most famous, 1492, Christopher Columbus, funded by Spain, sailed west across the Atlantic Ocean, hoping to arrive in the east, and he accidentally landed in the Americas. The other most famous, 1497, Vasco De Gama, launched a voyage that took him around the southern tip of Africa, along the East African coast, across the Indian Ocean, all the way to southern India. The biggest difference between Chinese and European expeditions was the size and scale of the trips. So Columbus had 3 ships and a crew of about 90. Vasco da Gama had 4 ships, a crew of about 170. Zheng He had 300 ships and a crew of about 27,000. So to add to that, Zheng He's ships were bigger. So it's believed all of Columbus's and De Gama's ships combined could have fit inside one of Zheng He's ships. The Europeans and the Chinese also had different reasons for wanting to launch these maritime expeditions. Europeans were really trying to get in on the wealth of Africa and Asia, the gold trade, the silk trade, the spice trade. Europeans were also Christians, and Christianity is a missionary faith, so part of that tradition was to spread Christianity. Europeans were hoping to convert people, and in the best case scenario, they were hoping to gain new allies against Muslim forces. So, again, the thing that's really crucial here is that the Chinese voyages stopped, whereas the European voyages kept on going. Zheng He's voyages might have been more impressive than those of Columbus and De Gama, but they didn't have the long-term historical impact. So, this really is a key turning point in history, and as historians we have to ask ourselves, why did Europe continue sailing? Why did China stop? For starters, it's important to look at the power structure in China versus Europe. So we know China is a very centralized government, and when the court officials decided that they weren't going to support the expeditions anymore, that ended all of the expeditions. Western Europe was fragmented, so there wasn't any central authority. Nobody could say, okay, we're not going to do expeditions anymore. Nobody could have that one final voice. So support for Zheng He's voyages wasn't strong beyond the emperor, and when Yongle died, those opposed to the voyages won out and the voyages were cancelled. Europeans also had much more to gain from trade than China. So Europeans were trying to break into the rich markets of the Silk Road and the Indian Ocean basin, and China was really already central to these markets. So these were the richest markets in the world, and China was already a major player. Europeans were outsiders trying to break in, trying to become a part of it. And for Europeans, going overland wasn't an option any longer, so this was how it was done during the Mongol Empire, because Islamic empires were now blocking the overland route to China. Yet another reason, Europeans were constantly at war with each other, and China wasn't afraid of anybody. They're the most powerful civilization in the world. They didn't need military allies in the Indian Ocean basin. Shouldn't say they weren't afraid of anybody. They did need to protect their northern borders from invasions from nomads. Finally, in terms of spreading their culture, the Chinese were never really interested in spreading Chinese culture or establishing colonies. They were happy with tribute payments. Europeans, they weren't unified politically, but they were unified under the banner of Christianity. And for the church, these maritime expeditions presented new opportunities for converting people to Christianity. So, all in all, Europe had a whole bunch of reasons to want to go out and explore the world. China, for their part, they viewed themselves as the self-sufficient middle kingdom. They were the superior culture. They shouldn't have to go out and look for things. If they needed something from somewhere else, somebody else would bring it to them.